You think you're being bullied by your mom, but it's all in your head, right? Mom is just teaching you how to be a proper daughter-in-law. You're so good at not playing the victim. These were Steve's words when I shared my concerns about the harassment from my mother-in-law. Pamela consistently threw away the meals I prepared and discarded the laundry I hung out to dry. To Steve, this was just his mother's way of instructing me in the ways of being a good daughter-in-law. Seeing my silent frustration, Steve merely chuckled dismissively and said something that left me in disbelief. My name is Laura. I'm 28 and work at a pharmaceutical company. Steve was a college friend, and we married 3 years ago. I lost my parents around the time I graduated from college. Their deaths were sudden, and as an only child, I felt isolated and adrift. My parents didn't maintain much contact with relatives, so the funeral was attended mostly by acquaintances and friends. Grieving was barely an option as I dove into my new job, where I met Steve through a mutual friend. Out of sympathy for my loss, Steve frequently invited me to his parents' home. His parents welcomed me warmly from the start, and I believed in our strong bond even after our marriage. I enjoyed Pamela's cooking and hoped to continue working after having children, feeling that I'd need help if I couldn't place our future kids in daycare. When I voiced my concerns to Steve, he assured me that Pamela would be there to help, and things initially went smoothly. I moved in with Pamela and Steve while my father-in-law was away on a job assignment, so it was just the three of us in the house. Initially, things were fine, but after 3 years of living with my in-laws and struggling with infertility, Pamela's attitude toward me shifted dramatically. She would say, "Laura, how many times do I have to remind you? You're the youngest here, so it's your job to handle the housework on weekends." Pamela continually pushed her chores onto me, despite my already significant responsibilities around the house. She would deliberately drop my freshly laundered clothes in the yard and dirty the dishes I just cleaned, forcing me to redo them. Her constant nagging about trivial matters and lectures on not providing grandchildren took a heavy toll on me. Steve's lack of understanding only deepened my sense of despair. I repeatedly told Steve about Pamela's harassment and insults, but he always brushed it off with comments like, "You're imagining things," or, "You're overthinking it." Pamela never harassed me in front of Steve, so maybe he couldn't believe his mother could act so cruelly. Regardless, Steve's dismissive attitude was unacceptable. It felt like Pamela was the victim and I was the villain, leaving me feeling completely isolated in my own home. Once Steve's disbelief became apparent, Pamela's mistreatment escalated. What was once hidden now occurred openly, with verbal abuse and harassment becoming a constant presence. Around this time, I discovered I was pregnant. Despite moving past the difficult phase of morning sickness and entering a more stable period, my heart felt heavy. The relentless harassment from Pamela, combined with Steve's disbelief and his own harshness towards me, were overwhelming. Even though Steve had been thrilled about the pregnancy initially, he now joined Pamela in disparaging me, calling me a lazy woman who does nothing but eat and sleep. I knew stress was harmful to the baby, but I felt trapped with no apparent solution. Despite everything, Steve was still the only person I could turn to. I decided it was time for a serious conversation, hoping that confronting him about Pamela's mistreatment might change his attitude for the sake of our unborn child. One weekend, I approached Steve while he was lounging in the living room. "Hey, there's something I need to talk to you about." Steve looked up lazily from his phone. "Lately, both Pamela and you have been really cruel to me. When Pamela harasses me, you just ignore it and pretend it isn't happening. Can you please stop doing that?" Steve's expression was blank, as if unsure whether to listen, before he mockingly turned his attention back to me. "You're just overreacting. What mom does isn't harassment. How can you say that? Throwing away the food I make without touching it, deliberately littering my room, isn't that harassment? Maybe mom thinks she's teaching me to be a proper daughter-in-law, but it's more than I can handle. I can't raise a child in this toxic environment. You and Pamela may see it as normal, but it's destroying me. I'm at my limit." My hand rested on my stomach, trembling slightly as I spoke. My anguished plea seemed to fall on deaf ears, and Steve's response was only mocking laughter. At my breaking point, Steve said coldly, "If it's so bad, why don't you just leave? Neither mom nor I would be troubled by your absence." His unexpected suggestion stunned me for a moment, but then I pressed my hands against my belly and exclaimed, "What are you talking about? I'm pregnant." Steve's indifferent gaze and dry laugh made it clear he didn't care. "Right, you have nowhere to go. With no parents and no home to return to, you're left with nothing." Steve's mocking words echoed in my mind. I bit my lip and glared at him, my anger palpable. "What's with that look?" Steve asked, slightly uncomfortable under my intense stare. After a tense pause, I said firmly, "I'm going back to my parents' home." Steve's laughter erupted. "Go back if you can. You'll probably end up on the streets, talking big about going back to your parents." As Steve continued to laugh, I pulled out a large Boston bag from the closet and began packing clothes and valuables. Steve seemed to think I had no alternative but to stay in his parents' house, believing I would ultimately return out of necessity. Pamela, who had overheard, joined in with, "It's your fault for not following the rules of this house." Like Steve, she seemed to think I should leave if I couldn't handle it. I was determined never to return to my in-laws' home. Once I had settled elsewhere, I planned to send divorce papers. After packing, I turned to Steve and Pamela, who were still laughing unpleasantly, and said, "Goodbye." I resolved then to raise my child on my own, knowing they would never see our daughter. A year has passed since I left my in-laws' house. I successfully gave birth to a daughter, and despite the challenges of parenting alone, I've never returned to them. 3 months after leaving, I sent Steve divorce papers, which were processed without issue. I also requested child support, but Steve hasn't paid. It looks like I'll need to consult a lawyer and negotiate with him in the future. Meanwhile, I'm doing my best to lift my spirits. I gazed up at the towering high-rise in front of me. A sign reading, "Model Room Open for Viewing," prominently displayed at the entrance. Occasionally, other visitors arrived to check out the property. I was considering buying a condo before returning to work, as my current place was far from both my workplace and the nearest childcare center. Since I'd be raising my child alone, it was essential to find a more convenient location and settle down soon. Fortunately, I had the financial means to purchase a condo. After registering at the reception on the first floor, I was escorted to a room on the top floor. I followed the guide to the elevator, which ascended to the 50th floor. When the doors opened, I was taken aback to see Steve standing there. He was the last person I expected to encounter in this setting. Steve, who was supposed to be working at a securities firm when we were married, had evidently changed careers. Steve looked visibly unsettled as our eyes met, clearly unprepared for our encounter. This was the top floor of a high-end apartment building, accessible only to serious buyers. With an awkward smile, Steve began showing me around the floor. Despite his courteous demeanor, his frequent, puzzled glances made it clear he was wondering why I was here. The room itself was impressive, close to my workplace with an underground connection to a childcare center. As expected from a luxury high-rise, it featured a park in the courtyard and a 24-hour supermarket below, making it an ideal place to raise my child on my own. "I think I'll take this apartment," I said. Steve's surprise was evident. I had come prepared to sign a contract immediately if I found a place I liked. However, Steve did not produce the contract despite my waiting. Just as I was about to ask him about it, his lips quivered, and he spoke. "There's no way a single mom going through a divorce can afford the top floor of a high-rise," Steve said, his face a mix of disbelief and something that felt almost accusatory. "Did you find a rich guy to support you, or are you involved in something shady?" I took a step back as he closed in. "No, I simply sold my family home for more than I anticipated." "Your family home?" Steve seemed skeptical. I explained the situation from the past year. After leaving my in-laws, I had moved back into my family home, which was in my name. Both my parents had passed away, and the house was too large for me to manage alone. The elaborate water garden, a project of my father's, likely added to the home's value. Just before the baby was born, someone offered to buy it, but I hadn't expected it to fetch enough to afford the top floor of a luxury high-rise. Steve's doubt was understandable. The house was old and showing signs of wear. I had thought the proceeds would cover living expenses for a while, but the buyer was a wealthy individual who valued the water garden more than the house itself. He offered 5 times the market value, motivated by his interest in the garden. Despite its current state, I explained that the garden was a personal hobby, not professionally landscaped, and that I had only maintained it minimally. The buyer appreciated the potential and planned to have it reworked by a professional gardener. He even added a living allowance to the purchase price. Feeling sympathetic towards me, this generous offer allowed me to afford a nearby apartment, focusing on childcare without financial concerns. Hearing my explanation, Steve's eyes briefly brightened before his demeanor shifted. He adopted a humble tone and offered an apology. "I'm sorry for what happened. Can we start over?" His face exuded confidence, as if he was certain I would accept his offer. But I didn't take his hand. "I can raise my child and live well without you. I have no desire to be with someone who looks down on others." At that moment, Steve's expression darkened with anger. He glared at me, his face contorted with fury. "You're rejecting my offer to remarry? You?" Just then, a colleague appeared behind Steve, perhaps drawn by our prolonged conversation. Steve cast a quick glance at him but seemed otherwise oblivious to his presence. "A woman being rich is just wrong. Women should quietly support their men and stay at home." The colleague's face went pale at Steve's comment. I silenced his attempt to intervene with a stern look. "Is that all you wanted to say? So now that you think you're successful, you feel you can look down on me? You were better off as a servant in your own home." I sighed and turned to the employee, who stood frozen with a stack of contracts and documents. "I can't make a major purchase from a company that employs someone who speaks like this." At my words, Steve finally turned around. The employee, realizing he was being addressed, rushed over, apologizing profusely and nearly scattering the documents in his haste. I'm so sorry. My subordinate was incredibly rude to you. Please, apologize as well, the boss urged Steve, who seemed to realize the situation was spiraling. Steve and his boss apologized repeatedly. Please stop, I said, cutting them off. The boss hesitantly looked up. I won't be buying the apartment. I'll look at other options. Their faces fell into expressions of despair. Wait, I'll reconsider everything I said. Just this contract? Do you really think I'd finalize a deal with someone after all you've said? Steve's defeat was clear. The outcome was a loss for Steve, who had always looked down on others, and for his boss, who likely hoped that our ex-spouse connection would smooth things over. I felt little sympathy. I liked the apartment, the location and layout were perfect, but I couldn't justify spending my money with a company that had such individuals. I left them behind, bowing as I exited the room. No one saw me off as I took the elevator down and walked away, determined to find another place. Later, I learned from Pamela that Steve not only lost the big contract for the top-floor apartment but also faced a pay cut and demotion due to his behavior, eventually leading to his resignation. Struggling to find new work, he turned to alcohol and gambling, with Pamela taking care of him. When I ran into Pamela at the supermarket, she pleaded with me. My son isn't working and stays at home, taking his frustration out on me. I'm sorry for everything. Please remarry him and come back. I responded quickly. Why don't you leave the house if it's so bad? Pamela's face fell in despair, and I felt a small sense of relief. I purchased an apartment in a different building and returned to work. With my child and childcare, the funds from selling my family home were more than enough to support us. I loved my job and, after being asked to return, accepted with a recent promotion. Now, I'm living a fulfilling life, balancing work and childcare.